Alright, this is the debrief video after the Utah trip. I'm going to discuss how that bike performed and some things that went wrong and things that went right. I also have at the end of this video a parts list with prices. If you can do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, that would super help me out. I'll be able to do more of these videos. I appreciate it. Thank you. Enjoy the video.
All right. Hey, we've got, I'd like to do a review on this XR650L, and you've seen all of the build series. If you haven't, there should be a link in here somewhere. You could also go back to the website and check out the different, I think there's 5 or 6 videos we've got. Also, you probably just saw the Utah video where we did have a breakdown, and that was due to a sprocket. About to put that sprocket on now, and let me see if you can get a good view of what that looks like, completely stripped out. And let's open up the new one and what that sprocket should look like right there. Now, the difference between these two sprockets, they look very similar. Bit harder gears on the internal spline, and other than that, I mean, quite similar, both 15s. So we'll put the new sprocket on. Counter shaft is just fine. I'm gonna skip to why the sprocket stripped. This bike has 12,000 miles on it. Those were all on the street. And the XR650L does not have a cush drive rear hub. So the riding on the street more predominantly than in the dirt, you're going to get a lot more wear on sprockets, chains, gears, things like that. And with a soft OEM sprocket after 12,000 miles, it's going to end up stripping out. Luckily, it's very hardened steel shaft here, so it did no damage to that. Something I probably should have looked at, actually a couple of you commented in the build series that, hey, replace that sprocket. Unfortunately, I was already headed to Utah before I saw that. I may have even made a comment about that, that I had seen that. And I checked the sprockets, good rear sprocket, great chain. The front sprocket looked good, and it didn't feel like it had any slop in it, but of course with the chain on, I maybe just not been able to feel it. It wasn't long until that stripped out completely. Anyways, that said, new sprocket will be back in business, pretty easy fix. If I'd had it on the trail, I would have just replaced it really quickly. So I wanted to go over a few things. One of them is the suspension on this bike, and we did make a modification of the front, but the rear suspension is stock, and I see no reason in changing that stock suspension. This bike is a long travel, it has a high ground clearance. It has so long travel, a lot of stroke in the suspension, both in the front and in the rear. The way the shock is set up, it's not a short travel rear shock. It's a long travel, long stroke rear shock. It has tons of adjustability in it. You can bring that thing to completely locked up to super ultra soft. Rear shock, you almost couldn't go better than that. Honda did a fantastic job on that. Stock rear suspension, unless it's blown out, which I really doubt they overbuilt that sucker, I would stick with the rear shock. With the front forks, a lot of guys are taking the front forks and they're taking them off, and Lord Almighty, send them to all the XR guys, because this is again, long stroke, long travel suspension system. If you take and put on an XR450 front end on this bike, you're going to limit that amount of stroke that you have. That bike is built more for a little bit shorter stroke than this, and for a much lighter motorcycle. They act completely different. So a bike that's this heavy, just north of 300 pounds, you need, and it works well with a lot of suspension travel, a lot of stroke in the suspension, and you rely on that rather than the short, and it tries to stop you much quicker. So it's a bit more plush of a suspension system. Okay, so that said, keeping with the stock suspension, you have a couple of options. Right off the bat, they're way, way, way too soft. in stock form. So the valving, you're never going to get there with the stock valving. So you can do one of two things. You can replace the oil in the suspension, and I went to a 15 weight oil, and that helps quite a bit. But you still need to add a little bit of volume. I believe it was 10 mil. You have to 50 mil more volume. You have to look at the last video. I kind of go over what I did with that suspension and show you how I did it. But going to a 15 weight oil brought me in range of what I need for the forks and the way I need them to act for large G outs. Unfortunately, in the video we captured, you don't get to see any of that, but we experimented through some deep troughs and some creek crossings and some very large whoops, and the bike just does extremely well. High speed whoops, very large G outs into ravines, and you just don't bottom the suspension out. It just has all the travel in the world. Well, one more thing I will mention, I dropped the bike in the fork. Okay, I brought the forks up in the triple clamps by about a half an inch, and it makes the bike steer a bit quicker, and in the sand maybe a bit too quick. I'd probably bring that back up, but with the luggage I had on it, I really need to be able to touch the ground and get off the bike. So I did that. I'm going to put the suspension back up into the fork tubes. It gives this a 38-inch seat height, but you have mass amount of ground clearance, and the front suspension is going to work the way I want it to. A little bit slower steering for such a heavy bike. That tends to work out well. So I'd say recommended there that keep the stock forks. You could replace the valving as well. I'd keep the stock springs. The stock springs are longer than the aftermarket ones they're sending you. The aftermarket ones, you need to put spacers in. You're going to lose some of that stroke. You could end up doing some bottoming, and that'll do some damage. I'd stay with the stock springs. I would change the fork oil out to a 15. If you want to, you could change the valves out. And if you change the valves out, you're going to just have a lot more adjustability. For really soft stuff, this thing does pretty well. I've got it pretty maxed out for the really hard stuff and the big G outs. So that's about where that front suspension sits. Let's move on to wheels. So we put these wheels on it. Very cool looking wheels. A lot heavier duty than stock, and for the heavy duty off-road desert stuff, fantastic wheel set there, and a pretty reasonably priced. I'll go ahead and do a listing of everything that I bought for this bike. I'm not sure you can see the balancing. I balanced these wheels out with these weights. They're super bling and look cool, and actually worked fantastic. Up to 80 miles an hour, the thing just true as could be, no problem at all. All right, moving on from there, the front fender is a lot better. I just love the way it looks, and it's not hanging down quite as far in front, so it just feels like it works better. Just looks cooler. Large tank, a 5.8 gallon tank. This beast is not sipping fuel, so 38 miles per gallon, probably at best. I was down to 29 and 30 miles per gallon in some places. So having a 5.8, not only did I have enough fuel to get where I needed to go, but in a pinch I was able to take off a bunch of that fuel and give it to my buddies so that we could get the heck out of there. Let's move on back to the foot pegs. These are IMS Pro foot pegs, very sharp foot pegs, and they keep your foot planted at all times. Just love these foot pegs. Some people go with the pivot pegs. On a really extreme off-road bike, I don't really like my foot moving. It changes the pitch, and when you're shifting and braking, that sort of changes with your foot. I like it to be with the bike. It's just a personal preference. These are a little bit lighter, don't have a bunch of mechanisms, so there's no possibility of them going having a mechanical or anything like that. I put the foot pegs back on because I used the luggage to strap on here. This seat, though a little bit higher, you can get a lower seat. That might be recommended. Go with a low seat rather than a high seat. This is a very tall motorcycle, I'll say once again, but this seat's super comfortable. able to move around, spend 12 days, yeah, 12 hours in the saddle, still no problem, just running this bike. And that's another thing to talk about is just how well this bike does. And you just ride and ride and ride and ride. It's a 2004, all day long, no problems with this motor. Just fantastic, using zero oil. Oil looks just as fresh as when I put it in. And just fantastic. You know, a little bit of longevity over performance, I would say. You get the newer bikes, highest performance, but just on a trip like that, I would have had to change my oil 3 times. That would be crazy. So this, I don't even need to change the oil yet. I've got, you know, I can do 3 more of those trips without having to change the oil. I'll take that all day long. Let's go into carburetor. So it is carbureted, not fuel injected. So another thing you may want to think about is what altitude you're going to be riding in and jet appropriately for that. There's a Dave's mod that you can do that will kind of help with that. Helps with the jetting a little bit. I ran into a little bit of problems at high altitudes, 9,500, 10,000 feet. Bike was bogging a bit, but I had sort of a, there was an RPM range that I'd run in that would just be fine, but I couldn't give it full throttle. It would just run out of air. So you could jet for that and you'd be just fine. Lower elevations doing just great. How about the skid plate? The skid plate did fantastic. It's a lightweight skid plate, and it holds up quite well. I'll also mention that it does really well against heat because it's right next to that exhaust pipe. I know I've showed this before, but right in here, it's super, super close to that exhaust pipe. It didn't melt, it didn't burn. No issues. I'm not gonna mess with it. The factory that makes this, they said I should cut it back about a ½ an inch away, but it's not affecting it. I'm not gonna worry about it. What else do we have here? Oh, well, let's go up to the bars really quick. So here's the bars. This is really one of the biggest differences. I don't think this bike could be ridden as hard off-road if you don't change out the bars and risers and moving the bars forward. This would be minimum. That's about 1.5 to 2 inches forward with just the bar risers. It's about 1.5 inches up. And then the bars themselves, this is the factory Suzuki and stock KTM bend. It's pretty straight across, not too much of a pullback. The stock bars pulled back about this far, so I'm really a good 3 inches farther forward than stock, and that's a bare minimum. I think that's it sets the bike up well. It brings your weight a bit forward, helps with handling, and you can actually stand up in the seat and ride all day with you know, standing. Tusk bark busters, they're fantastic. That's kind of my new go-to now. I'm really impressed with those. All in all, hey, this bike did fantastic. It's you know, we're getting to wrap up this project and we'll have to sell her on and let her go to a new home. I'm gonna miss this bike tremendously. Just a fantastic, and they say beast of a bike. It's a bike that will just last forever. This is a apocalypse bike. It is absolutely bulletproof, except for that sprocket. So let's say you go buy one of these bikes, take a look, and I'd probably just say replace the sprockets. They've got the recommended one is this primary drive. At the time I ordered this, it was sold out in a lot of places, but I found it on Amazon. Got it relatively quick. Anyways, cheers guys. Maybe we'll get a couple more clips of doing some of those G-outs here and I can add those in. If not, this may be one of the last videos. I'm trying to get one in before winter sets in totally. One more trip on this bike. It's dirty now, so I do need to clean it up, and we'll get that done next. Cheers. I'd also like to touch on the tires that are on this motorcycle. So on the rear tire, I have, let's take a look at that. This is the Tusk Recon. It's their gummy tire. This tire is not DOT rated, and it is massive. It's a tall tire. It is a tube type. We've got a heavy duty tube in here. I ran 20 psi, and this thing tracks really well. It has massive grip. Just does fantastic, and actually did quite well on the road. I mean, they're knobby tires. They're gonna be a little bit sketchy on the road anyways, but it did better than a couple of the DOT tires I have, which is kind of surprising. This one is the this one I have to look. This one it's a Kenda, and it is the Trackmaster. So this is the Kenda Trackmaster tire, and it is DOT rated, and this one is pretty sketchy on pavement. Pretty sketchy, I'd say, but it's, you know, it does well off-road. It did great in the sand. It tracks really good. You know, it was a good combination for me, and once the tire softened up a little bit on the road, it did just fine. It still has a, you know, it lasts pretty long. Maybe it's DOT rated because it's a pretty hard rubber, but does well off-road. And it does, and I say sketchy, it's just not perfect. You're not, you know, it's not one of these. If I go over here and take a look at these tires, these are the TKCs, you can tell it's a lot more rounded, treads a lot closer together. It's going to do a lot better on road. When you get something like this, some large spacing, it's just not going to do that great off-road. I mean on road, sorry, on road. Anyways, I love that Recon. It's just a bit tall of a tire, so you got to keep that in mind. This is geared down just a little bit. That's one thing I should talk about too, is the gearing in the transmission on the XR650L. First gear is really low, and then the gears are tall beyond that. So there's a big gap between first and second. And it just takes a little bit of a learning curve to realize that you go in first gear and just draw first gear up a lot farther in the rev range, and then shift into second, and you're going to be right in the right spot with that. Versus most bikes, you're just shifting. It's a lot more close ratio. This is a wide ratio between first and second, and it's just a learning curve if you're used to a different bike. It is nice because when you get in a really tight spot, that first gear is nice and low, and on a heavier bike, you want a really low first gear. It just helps you tractor up anything, go around obstacles, maneuver in really tight spots. I never had an instance where I stalled this bike, and that's probably due to that first gear. All right, I think that's it, guys. Related parts list for the bike. So the bike, about $3,500. Rocks Pro risers, $80. Hyde Racing skid plate, $136.37. Service tank, that's the 5.8 gallon, is $203.28. Seat Concept seat, that's buying the seat cover and seat foam separately and doing it yourself, $196.64. The IMS Pro foot pegs at $70. Pro Taper grips, $18. Pro Taper Suzuki KTM blend contour bars, $70. Poly Sport UFX Free Flow fender, $30. I believe that's a CRF 450 fender. The XR650R taillight, you can find those in a bunch of places. $15 is what I found it for. The blinkers, $30 for a set of 4. Tires, the Tusk Recon and the Kenda Trackmaster. It's $120 for the both those tires. KKE wheel set, I found those for $632.56. The Tusk D-Flex Pro handguard. I love those handguards, man. They come in like 4 pieces that they sell you, and those are $70 for the whole thing. FMF Powerbomb header and the Q4 exhaust, $554.38. The mirrors, $25, pretty cheap. Those are pretty nice too. IMS heavy duty tubes, $40. That's for 2 of them. It's a pretty good deal. Anyways, rim locks, bolts, spacers, the whole bit, all those together about $35. The sprocket was about $20. I think it was $18. There was some shipping added on top of that. I did add up all the hours, and there, you can go with some kind of cost rate, but who cares? So the total build for the parts, that's including the bike, $5,846.23. You know, it's a super cool bike for that. Anyways, cheers guys. Take care.